thank you for being with us. Just to be clear, the theme or the subject of today's sermon is Gideon. However, I can't help but comment on the worship service. We appreciate that, Eric, and particularly the secular trusting only in thy merit. That is the key to what got Gideon through the trials that he went through. So, on that note, most of us know the record of Moses in the Bible, of the exodus of the people of Israel from Egypt. If you never read the Bible, the book of Exodus, you most likely have seen the movie, The Ten Commandments. It's a whole other story. But the movie at least captured some of the basic biblical facts, along with significant creative license on their part. Namely, facts like the people of Israel were slaves in Egypt. The king of Egypt, Pharaoh, was a very cruel man. God recruited and sent Moses, born of Israelites' slave parents. Moses had providentially been adopted as a prince of Egypt. After confrontation with one of the Egyptian taskmasters, one thing led to another, and Moses ended up running away. After 40 years in the land of Midian, where he was hiding out, Moses received an assignment from God to lead the Israelites out of Egypt. By the way, this call from God was also an unwanted call. Even though Moses didn't pray for it, the people of Israel did. They cried out to the Lord, and God heard them. Anyway, God performed miraculous wonders that destroyed Egypt's power. This caused the Pharaoh to finally release the people of Israel. After leaving Egypt, the Israelites were to enter the land of Canaan, which was promised them by God. Eventually, it was the children of those who were 20 years and older when leaving Egypt that were actually the ones that entered the promised land. There were two older Israelite leaders who didn't meet that, who were cut off by that criteria. They were Joshua and Caleb, who happened to be very faithful to God throughout the whole process. They had faith in God rather than trusting in what their eyes told them. When Moses had died, Joshua led the people into the land of promise. After Joshua died, the Israelites embarked on a new phase of drama. And by drama I mean their habit of testing God's patience to the limit. One of those dramatic episodes was the reason that the children of the escapees from Egypt were not allowed into the land. God told them, go into the land, scout it out, and the majority of the spies that went into the land, were Galilee. The people in the land are huge. There's no way we can take them on. And Joshua and Caleb were the ones that insisted. God said, take the land, let's go. So they were forced to stay in the wilderness for another 40 years. And Joshua and Caleb, when they finally got into the land, Joshua and Caleb were allowed into the land. Joshua was the leader at that point, and after he died, they fell into their old habit, and particularly the habit they fell into was idol worship. This new phase of drama that occurred once these children entered the land can be found in the book of Judges, starting in chapter 2. When Joshua and all the others who had entered the land with him died, people forgot God. Now, verse 10 of chapter 2 tells us, a generation grew up who neither knew God nor what he had done for Israel. This new generation started doing things that God had warned their fathers against. They adopted the practices of the Canaanites, who remained in the land. They worshipped false gods, and started to marry with the Canaanites. So they picked up their culture and their habits. The result was they became like the pagans they were supposed to push out of the land. And so, having fallen into these pagan practices, this was the beginning of the new drama, what I call drama, in the Promised Land. The consequences of worshiping false God should not have been a surprise to the Israelites, but you remember, they forgot what God had done, etc., etc. God had warned them what would happen if they worshipped any other God but Him. Yet, having forgotten God, it is likely that they had forgotten Moses' warning to the nation, which was clearly laid out in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 4. And this is a little bit lengthy, but gives you a sense of the warning that God gives to them. It says, when you become the father of children, and children's children have remained long in the land, and act corruptly, and make an idol in the form of anything, and do that which is evil in the sight of the Lord your God, so as to provoke him to anger, I call heaven and earth to witness against you, that you will surely perish quickly from the land where you were going over the Jordan to possess it. You shall not live long on it, but will utterly be destroyed. The Lord will scatter you among the peoples, and you will be left few in number among the nations where the Lord drives you. There you will serve gods, the work of man's hands, wood and stone, which neither see nor hear nor eat nor smell. But from there you will seek the Lord your God, and you will find him, if you search for him with all your heart and soul. When you are in distress and all these things have come upon you, in the latter days you will return to the Lord your God and listen to his voice. The Lord your God is a compassionate God. He will not fail you nor destroy you, nor forget the covenant with your fathers, which he swore to them. So after Joshua and the elders associated with him had passed away, and the pagan practices began in Israel, the result was their enemies attacked and subdued Israel. Israel would then cry out to God under the burden of this subjugation, and God would deliver them as he had promised. And primarily because of his covenant with their fathers and their fathers' fathers. So, how God delivered them, he raised up judges. And these were the people who delivered them. And Israel enjoyed periods of peace during the lives of these deliverer judges. However, like a moth to a flame, Israel returned to their pagan ways after each judge died. Now, to give you a sense of how stubborn these people were, God gave Israel 13 judges between the time of Joshua and until they got a king, King Solomon. My focus today will be on the 5th judge, that's Gideon. And he was the deliverer of Israel. Israel followed the pattern of being obedient to God while they had a judge. Then they returned to worshiping man-made gods after the death of their judge. So it's not surprising that God punished them 4 times after Joshua's death and before the 5th judge. You do the math. Gideon, the 5th judge was Gideon. Over the span of that time of 5 judges, Israel experienced approximately 200 years of peace, but in the intervening time, they had 53 years of bondage or subjugation by other nations. And these were nations that God sent in as punishment when they got really out of hand with their idol worship. God responded to the people's cry for help from him. In the time of Gideon, it was the Midianites who were subduing the people of Israel. They had tormented them for 7 years. Now that they prayed and cried out to God, God responded to the nation's request for his help. God appointed Gideon as their deliverer and judge. Gideon didn't ask for this appointment, but there he was, as God's sovereign choice for this appointment. The Bible record of Gideon illustrates a reluctant leader called by God to deliver Israel from oppression. This record showcases themes of divine empowerment in the face of personal inadequacy, of doubt, of courage in the face of fear. Now, for the remainder of what I have to say today, I'll share some context of the scriptures that follow, the scriptures that I referenced. I'll then summarize the lesson that we can pull out of that regarding Gideon and his encounter with God. Even though these aren't the only lessons, but these are the ones that I chose to cover. Now, Gideon received the news from an angel that God had chosen him as the man for the job in response to Israel's prayers. In Judges 6:12, the angel of God appeared to Gideon, who was threshing grain in hiding because the Midianites pretty much took everything they could produce. If they increased the flocks, the Midianites, when they raided, they took that grain. And in this particular instance, the Midianites showed up in the land at the time of harvest. So they were ready to swoop down and take whatever crops the Israelites had. So Gideon was hiding in a wine press, threshing up the grain to be out of sight of the Midianites. Now, the angel appeared to Gideon, and this is what the angel says: God is with you, O mighty warrior. Can you imagine a farmer minding his own business, and he gets this kind of greeting? And he's addressed as, "Oh, mighty warrior." In today's vernacular, you'd like to say, what? Already we see that God had appointed and empowered this farmer who was to save the nation from its oppressor. At this time, Gideon wasn't even aware of the empowerment. I guess he was so taken aback. The fact that he was addressed as Almighty Warrior, or a messenger from heaven, didn't register. All he could think about is like, what? So, that is, Gideon was not ready to be identified as the one God wanted in response to the cry of Israel. He said to the angel, "With me, my master? If God is with us, why has all this happened to us? Where are all the miracles our parents and grandparents told us about? Didn't God deliver us from Egypt? The fact is, God has nothing to do with us. He has turned us over to Midian." God's reply was, "Go in the strength that is yours." Here again is the pronouncement of empowerment. "Save Israel from Midian. Haven't I just sent you?" Gideon again says, "Me, my master? How and with what could I ever save Israel? Look at me. My clan's the weakest in Manasseh, and I'm the rung to the litter in my family." God said to him, "I will be with you. You will defeat Midian as one man." Notice God's reassurance to a man in crisis over being called. He says, "I will be with you. Believe me, you will defeat Midian." Lesson number one that we can gain from these scriptures: God's call is not dependent on our abilities, but on his power working through us. Let me repeat that. God's call is not dependent on our abilities, but on his power working through us. And I thought of that scripture, the one line of the last song we sang, only trusting in his merit. This is an example of God's power working through Gideon, except he didn't know it just yet. We can see this in God's patient grooming of Gideon. Gideon was confounded at being selected to lead Israel's emancipation. God's patience and infusion of confidence into this timid hero becomes more apparent as Gideon's encounter with God continued. To his credit, as unbelievable as God's call to him was, he stuck with the assignment. Gideon took God at his word, even though he was not totally convinced yet. God instructed Gideon to first destroy his father's altar to Baal and the Asherah pole next to that altar. These were pagan gods that Israel were worshiping at the time. Being a very bright young man, Gideon waited until it was night, when no one was around, before he destroyed these pagan symbols as God had instructed. Now, the patience of God is revealed in dealing with the reluctant candidate for this deliverer judge. God gave a challenging task in his own community before he sent him out to take on the foreign invaders. When the townspeople saw their places of pagan worship destroyed, they were up in arms. The mob was ready to kill whoever destroyed their altars. That's how dedicated they were to these false gods. The mob ultimately found out that it was Gideon who had destroyed the altars. As the mob pressed him to take Gideon, Gideon's father stepped up. And to his credit, even though the father owned these pagan idols, he chose the pagan god. He chose his son over the pagan god. And here's what he said in challenging the mob. Are you trying to take revenge for Baal? Are you trying to rescue Baal? If you are, you'll be the ones who are put to death, and it will happen before another day dawns. If Baal is really a god, let him take his own revenge on someone who tears down his altar. Very logical argument, and logical enough that the crowd backed up. So not long after this incident, here is where God puts Gideon to the test. He sends him out on his assignment. The Midianites have gathered in the nearby valley of Jezreel. And here's Gideon's response. And this is what I meant when I said he still had his doubts about being assigned. But yet, God spoke, and Gideon up and went. So God's spirit came over Gideon. He blew his ram's horn, trumpet, and the Abiezrites came out, ready to follow him. He dispatched messengers all through Manasseh, calling them to battle. Also to Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali. They all came. For the record, the Abiezrites were also the descendants of Manasseh, so they were a separate clan, but they were of the same clan overall as Gideon, Manasseh. So men from these tribes came together to Gideon. Lesson number 2, what preceded. Even in the face of doubt, Gideon kept moving forward with God's plan. Something for us to keep close to our hearts. He was not shy about asking God for reassurance, in spite of what he could see. Gideon demonstrated faithfulness to God. Even though he was moving forward with all that God required him to do, Gideon still had nagging doubts, still thinking that the task was too big for him. So he had a couple more requests for God to validate that. Validate that he was the man chosen for the job. And you're familiar with the request. This is with the fleece. He asked God for hard evidence. So in Judges 6:36 and 37, this is what Gideon says to God. If this is right, you're using me to save Israel, as you said, then look, I'm placing a fleece of wool on the threshing floor. If dew is on the fleece only, but the floor is dry, then I know that you will use me to save Israel, as you said. You think, well, God did exactly that. And the next morning, Gideon got up, and the floor was dry and the fleece was wet. You think that made enough evidence for this man who was dubious about his assignment? So, someone like Moses negotiating for Sodom, he says, could I ask one more thing? So he asked God to do the reverse, to leave the fleece dry and the ground wet for the dew. God did that. So, the lesson we can get from this, lesson number 3, even when we can't see what we are worth in God's eyes, he sees it and is patient to help us grow in trusting him. What a wonderful God we serve. God having provided proof and reassurance, Gideon met with his troops the next morning. Here we transition to Judges chapter 7. God said to Gideon, you have too large an army with you. I can't turn Midian over to them like this. They'll take all the credit saying, I did it myself, and forget about me. Make a public announcement. Anyone who has any qualms at all about this venture, may leave Mount Gilead now and go home. 22,000 of these men left. 10,000 remained. So Gideon wasn't the only one with doubts, but Gideon had faith. What happened here tells us that 22,000 men had the same sense of inadequacy as Gideon. The difference was that Gideon had a personal encounter with God through a messenger. These men didn't. Here again, we see the unwanted nature of God's call in response to Israel's cry to him for help. In response to that cry for help, that prayer to help deliver us from the Midianites, Gideon was called, that's clear. But what's not so obvious is that the men of the tribes were called also. However, they thought it was too high a price to pay to be relieved from the grief that the Midianites were causing them. So it was an unwanted call to them, and they rejected it, so they left. So what we see in contrast to Gideon is, and here's lesson 4, people called by God experience a lack of hope when they depend on their own abilities instead of dependence on God's power working through them. It seems illogical, but we have a tendency, because of our human nature, to just fall into that trap. Things get so hectic, they're so oppressive, they're coming at us so quickly, and we lose sight of God, and we risk losing hope, or we risk losing hope because we lose sight of God. Gideon didn't. However, God wasn't done in preparing Gideon for his assignment. God said to Gideon, and here is in verses 4 and 5 of chapter 7 of Judges, there are still too many. Take them down to the stream and I'll make a final cut. When I say, this one goes with you, he'll go. When I say this one doesn't, he won't go. So Gideon took the troops down to the stream. Now, keep in mind, he's down to 10,000 men. And God is saying, it's still too many. So, Gideon does as God told him. God explained to Gideon what he was about to do. He said he had a test for the remainder of these men. The result would determine who stayed and who would be discharged. In brief, Gideon took the men to the stream and had a drink of water. Those who knelt down with their face in the water were discharged. Those who gathered the water in their hands, cupped and drank from it. Those were the ones that God chose to stay. 300 men cupped the water in their hands and drank it. Now, I've heard explanations over the years as to why God chose those 300. The thought being, reaching down, cupping the water, drinking it, you still can see what's in front of you. If you stick your face in the water and drinking it, you can't see what's going on around you. So the thought there, that theory is those who were watchful were the ones that God chose. So the other 9,700 men went home. Do you sense that God is pushing the limits of Gideon's faith that he had built up so far? Did I forget to mention, by the way, the Midianite alliance, the army Gideon was facing, was 135,000 men. And now he's down to 300 on his side. How was that for a test of faith? But now the 300 remaining men had to know that their only way of winning was by divine intervention. They stayed. And at least for me, I speak personally, over the years, I never looked at that aspect of it, that there were 300 men. Yeah, they were ready, but they had faith in God. They stayed because God's emissary, Gideon, said, this is enough. God didn't leave Gideon hanging at this point. He told him that night, go sneak into the Midian camp if you still have any doubts. So the implication is Gideon still, after all this, had doubts. Probably more so than before. He's down to 300 men. So Gideon arrived just in time to hear a Midianite soldier tell his friend the dream he had. He said, I had this dream. A loaf of barley bread tumbled into the Midianite camp. It came to the tent and hit it so hard it collapsed. The tent fell. Here's what his friend said. This has to be the sword of Gideon, son of Joash, the Israelite. God has turned Midian, the whole camp, over to him. Now, how's that for providence? These Midianites are speaking about Gideon and, in effect, prophesying through a dream. There we see God's hand on these men. Otherwise, where would they get this from? When he heard these words, Gideon fell to his knees before God in prayer. He didn't make his way back to the Israelite camp and rallied his men. He told them, God has just given the Midianite army over to us. Finally, Gideon didn't express any doubts whatsoever. Lesson number 5. Our questions and doubts do not disqualify us from God's calling. Isn't that a good thing to know? The Israelite army of 300 men defeated the Midianite alliance of 135,000 men with God's help. There is a postscript to the Israelite victory. The Israelites said to Gideon, after the war was over, rule over us, you and your son and your grandson. You have saved us from Midian's tyranny. Gideon said, I most certainly will not, nor will my son either. God will reign over you. So he had his eyes fixed in the right place after this experience. Then Gideon said, but I do have one request. Give me each one of you an earring that you took as plunder. That's because the Ishmaelites, who were part of this alliance with the Midianites, wore gold earrings, and the men had all their pockets full of them. They said, of course, they're yours. So Gideon gathered all this gold, and he made a golden ephod and put it on display in his hometown. All Israel, the way Scripture puts it, prostituted itself there. Gideon and his family too were seduced by it. So here's a man delivering Israel because God had punished them for idol worship. He creates this ephod of a gold, and unwittingly to him, I've said, what Gideon was thinking at the time, and he thought it was a great thing to do. He made this ephod, and he and the people in the worshiping had this ephod. How's that for idol worship? He comes right around and very quickly forgets where his deliverance came from. Right after the stunning victory over the Midianites, Gideon fell into idol worship, taking the people with him. Prior to victory, Gideon consulted God on his next steps. Apparently intoxicated with victory, he bypassed this most important step of checking in with God. He unwittingly set up a system of idol worship. Granted, it was not a representation of a person, but it was, like the idols, a lifeless thing, made by men's hands, that they began to worship. Gideon left a lasting legacy of what spiritual complacently post-victory can do to people. Lesson number 6. For us, victory is not the end of the calling, but a part of Christian discipleship and continued faithfulness. It is important to remain vigilant in faith after our triumphs. And that's a sober reminder for me, and I hope it is for you too. I will read again. Lesson number 6. For us, victory is not the end of the calling, but a part of Christian discipleship and continued faithfulness. It is important to remain vigilant in faith after our triumphs. Now, the 7th and last lesson is trust God, not only when He calls us out of our comfort zone, but we must trust Him continually. This begs a question, actually a couple questions that aren't so obvious. First question is, do I, or do we, as children of God, think of the call to share the gospel as an unwanted calling? I encourage everyone to meditate on this question and ask God what our next steps should be. This encouragement is both for those who answer the question in the affirmative or the negative. We who have answered the call to share God's gospel need to be reminded. For us, victory is not the end of the calling, but a part of Christian discipleship and continued faithfulness. It is important to remain vigilant in faith after our triumphs. The other part is we're called to trust God continually. And each of us needs to answer that question on our own. Trusting God continually, which is part of what we're called to do. Is that an unwanted calling? You may say, no, it isn't. But think about your actions, whether, I guess the best way of describing it is like passive aggressive, in that you say, of course I trust God. Well, your actions bear that out. So there's a challenge for each of us. So for many who have answered these questions, no, I don't want that call. It's too tough. I urge you to trust God He's greater than anything you can ask or imagine. Call on him to change your heart, to trust his loving care and leading you in all circumstances. And I can't help but go back to one of the other lessons. Yeah. That one is lesson number 3. Even when we can't see what we're worth in God's eyes, he sees it and is patient to help us to grow in trusting him. So let's not forget that even in the circumstances where we're and God, this road looks too rocky. In effect, you're saying, I don't know if I trust you with this, God. And that's what I was implying when he said passive aggressive. But we need to be able to answer that question in the affirmative as we grow. Yes, God, I accept that call. And I know I can't do it unless you take the reins from here. And I trust you enough to go with it. Like Gideon, even though he had doubts, he kept pressing forward. And you see the results of his faithfulness. That is all I have for you today. And I pray that it is a blessing to you.